And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is Dale Carrico. Dale is a professor, a lecturer in the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. He is visiting faculty in the liberal humanities at the San Francisco Art Institute. He is, in some ways, the bête noire of the futurist world. We have covered the world of techno-futurism here on the show. Dale is one of its most eloquent skeptics and critics, and we're delighted to have him on. Dale, thanks for joining us.
Hi there. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've been reading you for quite a while. Your blog is Amor Mundi, and Mundi, I guess, is how it's pronounced. Your Latin is undoubtedly better than mine. But listen, I do very much appreciate your wit in your writing and your incisive take on futurists. As you and I have discussed by email, I perhaps am slightly more generous in that world than you are, than I am. And we could talk about that, or vice versa. We could talk about that a little bit. But I guess what I wanted to start with was a piece you wrote recently about the Turing test. We keep hearing about the Turing test. We've covered it on this program before. My producer, Peter Callahan, and I debunked one of the so-called Turing test passages that was reported last year. I just read one last month, the poem that passed the Turing test, because it was a randomly generated poem, and I guess it looked like randomly generated undergraduate poetry. So what's your take? You wrote a great piece about it. What's your take on the idea that if you can, the Turing test, of course, says that if you can fool people into thinking it's a human being speaking, you have created, in effect, an artificial intelligence. So what's your take on that?
Right. Well, the first thing I'd want to say is maybe step back one step and provide a little context, because I write about lots of techno-scientific topics for the World Future Society and elsewhere, but lately I've really been on a roll. I've been talking about artificial intelligence discourse, exposing it, critiquing it, and so on, in essay after essay after essay, and part of the reason that that's happening, apart from the fact that it's just an interesting topic, is I think that there's a real kind of ramifying explosion of discourse about AI that's happening right now, and it's enormously important. It has not only philosophical, but important philosophical, political stakes. And it's represented, for example, by Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking and other figures who have recently signed a petition to stop super intelligent AI, which they describe as a kind of existential threat. There is a lot of discussion that's happening about so-called autonomous weapon systems as AIs. There's a lot of discussion of algorithmic mediation and all of the effects that it can have. In fact, sometimes the crash of the financial system is attributed to something like a financial software singularity, right? And part of what ultimately matters about the Turing test is that the Turing test is a kind of initial formulation of the assumptions and aspirations of what would become a larger AI discourse that's still playing out in public deliberation today. So I think it actually is very, very interesting and important to talk about the Turing test and what Turing actually said in the test. But I also just wanted to point out that it has stakes, and it has stakes in the present day. It may seem like a really abstruse or arcane philosophical topic, but strangely enough, I mean, it is an enormously fraught kind of topic to engage in today, and it has implications for military policy, on online media, questions of surveillance and harassment, and so on. So it actually connects to everyday life in far more ways than you might initially expect it to.
Well, I think as I listen to you, and as I've thought about this myself in the past, because I've also thought about it and written about it, I think one of the fundamental questions you're getting at, and one of the deep implications of this conversation about artificial intelligence, so-called, is the issue, are the issues very interrelated of agency and responsibility? Meaning, for example, it's not even the super intelligence that Elon Musk tells us, although we can talk about that, but it's when somebody calls your phone a smartphone and implies almost that it decides for itself what it's going to do, or you find the smart cars and so on. You have smart bombs is a perfect example, and you mentioned military policy, autonomous weapons. The notion of an autonomous weapon can be used, for example, to absolve the government and the leaders and the military officials who program that weapon from responsibility, or can be used in an attempt to absolve them from responsibility for the actions of that weapon when they're the ones who built and programmed it. So is that part of what you're getting at when you say that?
That's absolutely true, and of course, the question of the smart bomb in the context of wartime, in which we're now living, is one of the most urgent aspects of this kind of deranging AI discourse as it's playing out. And of course, I mean, we've been hearing about smart bombs for decades now. I mean, we're hearing quite a lot about autonomous weapon systems now, but the smart bomb is a kind of discursive production that became enormously important in the discussion of the first Gulf War, the first Gulf War, for example. People were talking about smart bombs, and part of what I would want to insist on is that we recognize the extent to which the smart bomb, like the phrase collateral damage, are both essentially rhetorical productions. They're not actually technical productions, and they function to displace our attention from problems, to absolve people from responsibility, to produce the impression of efficacy for specifically military agencies and so on. They may seem to be technical discussions, but in fact they're ideological. I would say the larger discussion that I kind of corral all of these issues under is something I sometimes jokingly refer to as artificial imbecilence, right, or artificial unintelligence. Mm-hmm. And that essentially has two interrelated theses that connect directly to that question of agency and responsibility that you mentioned before. I would say that artificial imbecilence, or whatever word that you would want to use to describe this idea that I'm talking about, it means on the one hand that when we attribute intelligence to that which is not, we risk losing the sense and significance of the attribution of intelligence to that which is. And so, given your example of the so-called dumb house or dumb card or dumb car that is described as a smart car or a smart card or a smart home, I propose that there's actually a danger in those attributions that we may come to denigrate the actual intelligence of actual human beings for whom a grasp of our intelligence is central to our capacity to actually do justice to them, to be responsible to their actual needs, to recognize the terms on which they're legible in the world, to understand them as fellow protagonists in a kind of historical narrative of struggle in the direction of justice.
And if you level the playing field, we're talking with Dale Carrico about so-called artificial intelligence and the ideology thereof. If you somehow level the playing field between living beings and artificial machinery, you then give enormous power to the creators and controllers of the machinery. And I think, so another aspect of this that I wanted to discuss with you, because I've been thinking about the Elon Musk thing a lot. I haven't gotten around to writing about it, but Elon Musk, famous tech billionaire, famously said several months ago that he thought we needed urgently to address the existential threat posed by artificial superintelligence. Well, first of all, as you have pointed out, there and others have pointed out, this is hardly, even if it's theoretically possible, which is questionable, this is hardly an immediate threat to humanity compared to, say, poverty, starvation, lack of drinking water, and so on. It is very, very abstract, non-present, perhaps entirely non-real threat. But if we accept that that's our number one threat to existence, then who can we turn to except people like Elon Musk? So isn't there a kind of, whether intentionally or not, and it may be intentional because he's a smart guy, isn't there a self-serving dimension sometimes in this kind of discourse too?
Unquestionably there is. And I mean, I would go so far as to say, just this weekend, I think, there was a protest that gained at least some attention, people arguing about the necessity to stop killer robots, and Elon Musk, among others, was a person who kind of signed on to that protest and used it as a way to kind of flog his issues. And it reminds me personally of nothing so much as the so-called protest that took place a little bit over a year ago when certain techno-immortalists petitioned the Google headquarters demanding that Google solve the problem of death, which is another element within this like kind of larger futurological complex of superlative aspirations. And I think that the simple thing that I would want to say about that is I think that there's a very real, and just to set aside philosophy for a moment, I think there's a very real dumbed-down sense in which these protests could actually be described as advertising or as advertorial happenings, ways of actually attracting attention and therefore freighting with a kind of false credibility a set of questions in which that Elon Musk is very particularly concerned. I mean, one way that you sell skin cream is to promise that it's going to provide, youthful skin by slathering it on a 14-year-old model in a late-night infomercial. The other way that you sell skin cream is to show kids in high school terrorizing one another because they have pimples. I mean, there's the carrot, and then there's the stick. There's apocalypse, and then there's transcension, right? There's the threat, and then there's also the promise. If futurology and futurological discourse often functions as just a kind of extreme marketing and promotional discourse for techno gizmos, I think that these very superlative aspirations that sometimes attach to technology, that it will be immortalizing, that it will connect us to super intelligence, that it will provide super abundance that gets us past the stakeholder impasse of historical struggle, whatever those aspirations may take, they too actually function essentially as a kind of marketing logic, or as you've said in other contexts, you've described it kind of straightforwardly as ideology, and I think that that's definitely true.
Right, and I think I tweeted to you the other day that artificial intelligence, as the term is used, is no more intelligence than spam as an artificial hog. I just like introducing the word hog into this conversation for some reason. But
that's a particular kind of bête noire I am.
Right, exactly. Hog. But the idea being somehow, again, there's an enormous grandiosity to it, and part of this ideology to me, but I want to get your thoughts, part of this ideology is that all of a sudden the urgent issues of the day are abstracted into non-existence. If in fact we think that Google is going to solve death and we just have to watch a few advertisements, in order to stay alive, I think I'd rather die. But if in fact Google and its ilk is going to cure death, or I should say, if we believe that, and if we believe that the only threat to eternal life and bliss is also technological, then all the more reason, as you say, infomercials, advertorials, all the more reason that we've just got to turn our entire cosmos. We've got to turn our world over to Elon Musk and Sergey and Larry and so on. And B, then we don't really need to worry about poverty anymore. We don't really need to worry about clean drinking water anymore. Sure, it's too bad for the kids who are dying now of malaria, but, in a few decades it will all go away anyway, so what do we care? Don't you think that's part of it too?
Absolutely true. I mean, I sometimes actually put the point by saying the only existential risk that the so-called existential risk critics of futurology should be focused on is the existential risk produced by the discourse itself. By focusing on utterly implausible, possibly incoherent, and not even practically possible outcomes, hyperbolic and superlative outcomes that really don't connect to the issues of the day in any real way, they distract our attention and our organizational capacity from the solution of actually shared problems. And of course, if we're going to be Google immortalized, you don't have to worry about single-payer health care. You don't actually have to worry about neglected diseases in the overexploited regions of the world. And as you said, we don't have to worry about the simple expedient of providing fresh water to everyone in the world, which I think Mike Davis described as the greatest miracle drug that could be made, quite apart from all of this silicon fantasizing. So absolutely, I do agree with that as well.
Well, I could talk to you about this for hours because this is a subject that deeply close to my heart and the heart of this show, but maybe you'll come back sometime. We've been talking with Dale Carrico, who is a lecturer in rhetoric and humanities at the San Francisco Art Institute and UC Berkeley. Dale, thanks so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
He can be found at amormundi.blogspot.com, right? He's gone.
We'll talk about Turing next time.
Right. Okay. We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.